Welcome to a special edition of Undercurrents, our daily news show from UnHerd's Washington Bureau. Make sure to subscribe to the channel here, wherever you get your podcasts, and also over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience, including longer versions of interviews like this one. Tuesday night in New York City, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz squared off on CBS in the only vice presidential debate of this cycle, just 34 days before the November 5th election. It was an extraordinarily normal affair, like an artifact of the pre-Trump era. Donald Trump himself came up, of course, but his stylistic influence mostly faded to the background. And by the way, from the men who spent the last few weeks calling each other weird, fighting about pets being eaten and tampons for boys, the world outside the studio, though, was anything but calm and anything but civil. I actually want to read this post from my friend Katie Pavlich. We have 1, a dock strike not seen in 40 plus years that could cripple the economy. Katrina-level devastation in a number of southern U.S. states. War raging and a stalemate between Russia/Ukraine. Hundreds of missile launches from Iran. So the debate began on that very sober final note, with questions on Iran and the influence of climate change on Hurricane Helene. Walz started shakily. Vance started strong. As Walz warmed up, though, he did pretty well, delivering some pretty clean hits on abortion and January 6th and tax breaks for the rich. He face-planted hard when pressed on whether he'd lied about being in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square massacre, and Vance, for his part, likely solidified himself as the most talented conservative standard-bearer of his generation. His performance was smooth and gaffe-free. He didn't come across as the weird and impersonal tech bro conservative that some of his pre-Senate podcast appearances conveyed probably to a lot of normal voters around the country. Even so, Walz got in a dagger right before the closing bell, asking Vance whether Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. Vance could not answer the question. Now, it's worth noting many ballots in this presidential election have already been cast because early voting is open for a good chunk of people around the country. It's also worth noting the vice presidential debate isn't exactly front of mind when people do cast their ballots either. But against the backdrop of a world in chaos, I bet a whole lot of viewers liked it. Friend of the show, Zed Jelani, called it, quote, a debate for adults. For more on all of this and some of the highlight clips from that debate, we are joined now by Robby Soave of Reason Magazine and Rising on Hill TV. Robby Soave, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, so Robby, Zed Jelani said that this was, quote, a debate for adults. Do you agree? Debate for adults tonight? Is that what we saw between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It was a very substantive debate, a lot on economic policy, how immigration affects the workforce, labor, areas where there are some commonalities between some strains of Republicans and Democrats, where the Republican Party under J.D. Vance and Donald Trump wants to be, appealing to blue-collar workers, where the Democratic Party has been historically but is now struggling given some of its cultural commitments to progressivism, that sort of thing. There was also less of the kind of attacking and going off script that is a little bit characteristic of Trump and Kamala had to respond to. So, yeah, I would say it was a policy-heavy debate that does not matter in one way at all because people don't vote based on the vice president, right?
Okay, so actually elaborate on that, because the debate started with this very sober moment about what had just transpired in Israel and between Iran and Israel about the 160 deaths from Hurricane Helene so far, hundreds of people missing. And Norah O'Donnell kind of opened it by saying, it feels like we have an unfolding series of crises on the eve of this debate. And then it was like the most normal debate ever. Like it was a total pre-Trump normal debate, wasn't it?
Yeah, and people might be looking to these two for leadership on these issues, given we have, Joe Biden is the president. We all have a lot of concerns about his mental cognition, his capability to be president.
Not a single question about that.
Did not come up at all.
And Tim Walz is running with the current vice president, who is defending the sitting president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, being so weak that his own party basically ousted him.
Yeah, who is obviously complicit in trying to cover up the fact that long before, or at least to some matter of weeks or months before, it became evident to all of the American people in that debate that he cannot serve another term. Maybe he can't even serve the rest of his term. She knew that and was complicit in covering it up. But they got to a lot of other things, so maybe they didn't have time to address this.
Let's stick on this issue of questions that weren't asked. So
Yes.
Mary Margaret Olohan pointed out no questions about gender ideology, and that had been actually a rift between Walz and Vance, sort of trading barbs back and forth. Walz tried to bring up book bans towards the end of the debate, something that he kind of went viral for, talking about a lot. He talks about it on the stump, talks about how J.D. Vance and Republicans are weird. These people are weird. That's the Tim Walz line.
There wasn't enough on COVID for me, is what I would have said.
Really?
There was a little bit on the censorship element of COVID. I don't think they really got into it on Tim Walz's own record.
They didn't. And there were also no questions about the assassination attempts on Donald
Yes.
Trump's life. So there are a couple of conspicuous absences. Let's actually talk, though, about that censorship point, because
Yes.
J.D. Vance, in what I thought for both Walz and Vance, I mean, I thought Vance had an excellent night. I thought Walz did okay. But Vance was, I think, more comfortable, stronger. But even that said, the moment where he was confronted about whether he believed Donald Trump lost the 2020 election was, I mean, I thought that was a dagger. Let's watch the clip. Walz confronting J.D. Vance on who won 2020.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further.
Okay, Robby, notably there, Vance pivoted the question to censorship. And I thought that was really interesting because he said this isn't just a problem with Republicans, which in a weird way sort of grants the premise that it is a problem with Republicans. But he tried to say Democrats are just as bad on censorship. They're the real threat to norms and et cetera. But, you know, the rhetoric is hot right now.
Overall, this was an incredibly strong debate performance from J.D. Vance, who, you know, I've not made a secret about, is not my absolute favorite choice for the people he could have picked to be VP, because he's not, you know, pivoting a little bit away from my own libertarianism. So I can admit he did a fantastic job. And he's in a difficult position, as are all Republicans, when they have to address how Donald Trump handled the last election. I think he did that as best as he possibly could. And then he did turn it on Walz on things that I think are legitimate for actions that were taken by the Biden-Harris administration to clamp down on speech on social media that we're all now a little aghast about, or more than a little aghast about, the extent to which the federal government was pressuring censorship. Tim Walz could have addressed this by saying, well, we're not going to do censorship. At no point did he say that. In fact, what he said was, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, which we all know.
Zoom in on Robby right now because he is cooking.
The outrage. You should have seen the reason Slack when that came up. It was just person after person going, no, because as I'm sure you know, and so many people watching probably do, that statement, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, is part of a Supreme Court decision that was in favor of censorship, that was used to stop people who were opposed to World War I from protesting it. That decision is no longer the law of the land. Subsequent Supreme Court decisions have voided it. So when you use that example, you are referring to a decision in favor of censorship that no longer holds any water. So it is not comforting to bring it up.
Go exercise your patriotic rights and yell fire in a crowded theater. Enjoy.
The metaphor is, if there is a fire in the theater, you should do that.
Yes.
If there is a danger, if you have some legitimate reason to speak, you should speak. And the government cannot stop you because your speech is hateful or it's misinformation or any of those things. Tim Walz previously has gestured at the idea of criminalizing misinformation. And this is very common now among many progressives, many media figures, many Democrats. So it is a legitimate line of inquiry. And I was not at all put at ease that Walz is somehow departing from what is now becoming the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party to be in favor of limiting speech on social media.
Now, I don't know J.D. Vance well. I met him. Have you met him? I've met him.
I've never met him.
He's a perfectly nice guy. And I wonder actually if he would agree with this point privately, because to me, I look at that exchange and say, we're in a doom spiral, right? Like the norm violation begets more norm violations because you're justifying, as a political party, lawfare, for example, with more lawfare, because the only way out in that logic is through. For the censors, the only way to restore democracy, as they say, is to clamp down on speech. Otherwise, we can't have a healthy functioning democracy. For the post-liberal right, the only way to restore freedom and normalcy in the country is to have like a red Caesar. That's an argument that we've seen trotted out, but it just gives the impression that like we're in a doom spiral. I don't know.
Well,
did you think that moment was as bad for Vance as I thought it was? Because that clip is going to bounce around everywhere.
I actually didn't think it was that bad. It was coming at the end of a very commanding debate performance. I was glad to hear, the January 6th related stuff, which we've now had to hear Trump address a gazillion times. You know what he's going to say about it. You know what J.D. Vance is going to say about it. I was happy to see that only get a few minutes of airtime because we've just really been over this ground before. And Americans who find the conduct related there to be contemptible and disqualifying. I do not begrudge them feeling that way at all. But haven't we settled that now? If you feel that way, you feel that way, and you've heard what they have to say about it. And there's a lot of other interesting stuff to get into, which they did for most of the debate.
Well, let's talk about that, because I thought the single most interesting exchange of the entire debate was, in a way, one that a lot of people haven't talked about. It was Tim Walz saying something to the extent, I'm paraphrasing, of, you have to trust Donald Trump. Don't trust the science. Don't trust the experts. And then J.D. Vance turned and absolutely dunked on Walz by saying the experts were the people who exported all of the jobs to China. The experts, I'm paraphrasing both of them, obviously. We have this clip of J.D. Vance on the so-called experts.
Governor, you say trust the experts. But those same experts for 40 years said that if we shipped our manufacturing base off to China, we'd get cheaper goods. They lied about that. They said if we shipped our industrial base off to other countries, to Mexico and elsewhere, it would make the middle class stronger. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about the idea that if we made America less self-reliant, less productive in our own nation, that it would somehow make us better off, and they were wrong about it. And for the first time in a generation, Donald Trump had the wisdom and the courage to say to that bipartisan consensus, we're not doing it anymore. We're bringing American manufacturing back. We're unleashing American energy. We're going to make more of our own stuff. And this isn't just an economic issue. I mean, I've got 3 beautiful little kids at home, 7, 4, and 2, and I love them very much, and I hope they're in bed right now. But look, so many of the drugs, the pharmaceuticals that we put in the bodies of our children are manufactured by nations that hate us. This has to stop. And we're not going to stop it by listening to experts. We're going to stop it by listening to common sense wisdom, which is what Donald Trump governed on.
Robby, did you find that exchange to be as interesting as I did? Because I'm looking at that, I'm saying this is the difference between the two parties right now, is Democrats becoming, as Roy Teixeira said on this program not long ago, the party really of the upper middle class, educated, suburban voters. Those are their demographics now, which is why they're comfortable with what Tim Walz is saying. And J.D. Vance saying, screw the capital S science and the experts. It almost felt like a distillation of where the parties have gone.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats are the party of trust in expertise and in institutions. If you look over time at this has crystallized this difference between the two parties. You look at trust in specific institutions, and there used to be ones that Democrats trusted and ones that Republicans trusted. Like Republicans have distrusted the media, they've distrusted academia for a long, long time. But they used to trust the military and law enforcement, the FBI. And now trust in the FBI among Republicans is lower than Democrats have ever felt about that organization.
They also used to trust business.
They used to trust business. Now it's, big business, censoring them, doing whatever, exporting jobs overseas. So the Republican Party is increasingly organized around people who distrust expertise in institutions. And I would say that distrust is often warranted, or at least skepticism.
100%. I'd be worried if there wasn't distrust.
Now, obviously, it can go too far in both ways. Just reflexively trusting, as many Democrats and the media do, in elite consensus can be wrong. I think on foreign policy, that has often led us astray. On COVID, that led us astray at least some of the time. There's at least legitimate debate. That doesn't mean I think institutions are always wrong. And then, they got into it on some of these economic issues that are very complicated, where experts do disagree, where there are trade-offs.
Totally.
We're talking about
tax cuts,
migrant labor, the effect that has. I believe that does depress wages for some American workers.
Stop the press.
Well, that's probably true. But also right now, Americans, the number one concern they have other than immigration is the high cost of goods and services and foods and things they're paying for. And I'm sorry, if you dramatically reduce or lower the workforce, you're going to make things more expensive. So that's a trade-off here. I understand why Republicans want to pursue the votes of people who feel like their wages are negatively impacted by immigrant labor, but also we're all trying to pay for things, and artificially constricting the labor supply is hurting a lot of aspects of our economy. So these are difficult and complicated questions, and they grappled with them, and it was nice to see that.
There was this tone for me that felt very pre-Trump. It felt like just guys hashing it out. David Frum posted on X that J.D. Vance left with Tim Walz's wallet. David Frum was very upset and said that Tim Walz was way too conciliatory, was way too civil, basically. And J.D. Vance also didn't really go after Tim Walz over stolen valor. Mm-hmm. Those accusations was something people expected him to raise because they're both veterans. But Tim Walz obviously has had to backtrack and answer some really tough questions on whether he fudged his military record, whether he's fudged his record on IVF. He's also backtracked on whether he and his wife used IVF. But J.D. Vance didn't go in on him. Tim Walz didn't go in on J.D. Vance on the Haitian pet eating. He brought up Springfield, Ohio, but it really was, they kept saying, I agree with the governor, I agree with the senator, and having these like refreshingly nice moments. I'm not David Frum in this situation. I don't know. Are you feeling Frummy here?
It was sort of hearkening back to a pre-Trump level of political discourse where you have debates where there's very vigorous disagreement, but it doesn't get quite as nasty in the same way, even if Trump-esque policies were being discussed, but it just didn't have Trump's personal flavor involved in it. Maybe that shows you that our politics will once again be like that whenever Trump truly does, if he ever does, exit the political scene. But Walz was just clearly nervous. I think he was afraid to really go after Vance on. He seemed painfully nervous at the beginning. I would argue he did better as it went on, but Vance was just so prepared rhetorically. And then, of course, the stolen valor thing didn't come up, the big bombshell from today about when he was in China. That was like the one tough question. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about the moderation. Maybe we'll get to that in a minute. One tough question they gave to him was on that, and he bombed it so badly.
It was one of the worst moments in any vice presidential debate in a long time that I can remember. So let's actually cue up this clip. This is Tim Walz getting confronted by what started as local media reports, then snowballed into reports in the Washington Free Beacon from CNN's K-File, Andrew Kaczynski, showing that Tim Walz had misrepresented, outright lied, actually, about being in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square massacre. His quotes are very clear, and you're going to see him get confronted about this. He plainly told people over and over again that he was in Hong Kong when Tiananmen Square happened. He was not. He wasn't there until months later. So take a look at this clip.
Governor, just to follow up on that, the question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
Robby, that is brutal. And you would think that his team, if they were prepping him for any question, this has been in the media over the past 48 hours, it's been a huge story. You'd think they would have prepared him for this.
Yeah, he has been called out as a serial exaggerator of his record on a number of different fronts. This isn't exactly new territory for a political figure. It's certainly survivable.
Totally.
Time and time again, political figures and major media figures have been caught exaggerating where they were. They love to do it for a battle zone or a zone where some kind of significant, possibly scary event took place.
Hillary Clinton came under sniper fire in Bosnia,
Brian Williams, we were revisiting that because he just got tapped to host some live election coverage for Amazon Prime. So I was going back over the long list of things.
Brian Williams is covering the hurricane.
Yeah, he's covering the hurricane. He was there when the Berlin Wall came down, he said. So this is not exactly new ground. It is survivable. It's not the biggest deal. But he did not answer it satisfactorily. He should have just not answered the question effectively. When they're asked something they don't want to answer, they just pivot. But he kind of hit it head on, but then didn't really explain his conduct. He should have just said, yeah, I misspoke, sorry, and moved on. He did not do it effectively. It was mostly, again, a rhetorical blunder, but man, it was a painful couple seconds there. It felt like forever.
And before we get to the moderators, let's talk a little bit about abortion, because it was one of the more interesting exchanges. It took up a significant chunk of time. This is J.D. Vance responding to a question about whether he would implement a national abortion ban. Take a look.
I grew up in a working class family in a neighborhood where I knew a lot of young women who had unplanned pregnancies and decided to terminate those pregnancies because they feel like they didn't have any other options. And, one of them is actually very dear to me. And I know she's watching tonight, and I love you. And she told me something a couple years ago that she felt like if she hadn't had that abortion, that it would have destroyed her life because she was in an abusive relationship. And I think that what I take from that as a Republican who proudly wants to protect innocent life in this country, who proudly wants to protect the vulnerable, is that my party, we've got to do so much better of a job at earning the American people's trust back on this issue where they frankly just don't trust us. And I think that's one of the things that Donald Trump and I are endeavoring to do. I want us as a Republican Party to be pro-family in the fullest sense of the word. I want us to support fertility treatments. I want us to make it easier for moms to afford to have babies. I want it to make it easier for young families to afford a home so they can afford a place to raise that family. And I think there's so much that we can do on the public policy front just to give women more options. Now, of course, Donald Trump has been very clear that on the abortion policy specifically, that we have a big country and it's diverse. And California has a different viewpoint on this than Georgia. Georgia has a different viewpoint from Arizona. And the proper way to handle this, as messy as democracy sometimes is to let voters make these decisions, let the individual states make their abortion policy. And I think that's what makes the most sense in a very big, a very diverse, and let's be honest, sometimes a very, very messy and divided country.
J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, post-Roe America. This is the most difficult question for Republicans because voters have gone to the polls, as J.D. Vance talked about in the debate, in his own state of Ohio and have shown profound disagreement with his position. And again, he openly acknowledged that on the debate stage, which is one of the more interesting things I've seen a politician do. It's also just smart politics. I'm curious what you make of it, because I'm watching that and I'm thinking, this is almost the best that he can do as a very pro-life Republican when you're within the parameters of Donald Trump's ticket, where he has said, he thinks certain laws have gone too far. I think he said the DeSantis 6-week ban went too far, and it's clobbering Republicans state after state, saying we need to come back to the basic question here of getting voters' trust. It was really interesting. Was it effective?
I thought it was as effective as it could possibly be. I agree with everything you just said. He was really speaking, and I think he knew he had to speak, to the voter who is perhaps willing to vote for Trump or Republican. Maybe you voted for Republicans in the past, but you're frustrated with Trump. Maybe you were not set at ease by the choice of J.D. Vance. I think if you're a suburban white woman who has pro-choice policies and maybe used to be a Republican, you're the category of people who really has a hard time with Donald Trump. J.D. Vance was not the pick to bring you back into the fold. Given that reality, I think those answers were as best you could do to try to make an appeal to that voter. If they were all watching and they heard that, I think it might have done him some good. Again, I have questions about how much this debate actually matters and if anyone whose vote is really up for grabs was watching, but under those circumstances, it was a very appealing pitch, I think.
Walz was pretty effective, too, and that's no surprise. He was very comfortable talking about abortion.
This issue is an advantage for Democrats, and Vance is good at this. He found a good way to talk about it, I thought.
So let's talk actually about the moderators, because after the last debate, Robby, you and I were sitting here, and we were both on fire because the moderation was atrocious and offensive. I'll say it. Offensive to journalists who look at that and just said this is not what the industry used to be about. This is putting your thumb on the scale for the sake of your own ideology. And this time, it was more similar to how CNN's Dana Bash and Jake Tapper handled the initial presidential debate back in June between Joe Biden at the time and Donald Trump, where the moderators sort of blended in the background. They said ahead of time they were not going to do any fact checking. I see Robby he's in his stance. He's like ready to dunk.
I mean, they said they were going to do that, right?
And they didn't. They actually offered some fact checks, and JD Vance responded to them kind of walking back their pledge, not just to the viewers, but to the candidates. So let's take a look at how JD Vance, A, kind of seized on that, and B, it was somewhat awkward for CBS.
Governor, and just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status. Temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app, where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole, and be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. That is not a person coming in, applying for a green card and waiting for 10 years. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process. We have so much to get to, Senator.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The CBP One app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created, Margaret.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut. We have so much we want to get to. Thank you for explaining the legal process.
So, Robby, the mics were cut, and I'm not sure that anyone looked worse or anyone looked bad in that situation except for CBS.
Yeah, I think the moderation was not worse than the last time, but it was sneakily offensive.
Ooh, okay.
Because there was all of that almost backhanded fact checking. Like they didn't cut in and say, but that's not true, and continue the argument. Once Vance, always only the Republicans, stopped talking, then they kind of did a side like, oh, well, experts say that this is actually the truth. Moving on, it was that was, as Vance said, then he cut in and said, okay, that is a violation of how you said this was going to be. Again, it only ever goes one way. They're incapable of doing this when the Democrat misspeaks. You can do it either way. No fact-checking whatsoever. Leave it to the candidate. Like, their questions to Walz were always like, you wanna jump in here, Tim? You got something you want to say to JD Vance about this? Right. It was like an assist. Again, it comes off as 3-on-1, just like the last debate did. What is it impossible? Can it not be done to either just don't do that or they have two moderators. They can't find, it's impossible. This person doesn't exist. We know this person doesn't exist. You exist. Sagar exists. I exist.
You exist.
A million different people exist who could be a moderator with a right of center awareness. Doesn't even have to be someone who actually is right of center, but right of center awareness.
Did a great job.
Sure. We know these people exist who could then deliver the same level of fire to the Democratic candidate as gets delivered every single time to the Republican candidate. They just choose not to, and at this point, it says enough.
It's so funny because I'm looking at this through a fully glass half full lens, and you're totally glass half empty. I saw that, and I was like, last debate was such a joke. It was so horrible that here we have CBS learning a lesson, and they're not perfect, but they bounce back. And Robby, you're just like, they are evil ghouls.
Yeah. I think that's what I said. Well, I'm just so sick of this. I'm just so sick of the one-sided fact-checking.
Yeah.
Nobody wants this. They said they weren't going to do it, and they just can't help themselves. They see no flaw inherently in what the Democratic side has to say, and that's a massive blind spot and a massive problem if you want to have a fair debate.
And we shouldn't be numb to it, but I guess it's easy to be numb to it.
Numbness is always understandable.
So let's go sort of full circle here, Robby. I think probably the biggest problem for Tim Walz, other than that, this debate just wasn't going to matter a lot for either of them, but probably the biggest problem for him was exposed really early in the debate. He was nervous, uncomfortable with the format. His camp had kind of telegraphed that through the press beforehand, that he had told Kamala Harris he wasn't a good debater when she was thinking about picking him and all of that. He didn't have any real faceplant moments other than the China moment. That was really brutal. But, are people making up their minds based on that? I don't know. Either way, J.D. Vance starts off with a question on Iran, talking about how Tim Walz has referred to Donald Trump as an agent of chaos. And I just want to roll this clip because I think this is going to become, as the world does start to spiral geopolitically at this moment, a devastating attack on the Harris-Walz campaign. So let's roll J.D. Vance here. This is clip 1 on deterrence.
Now, to answer this particular question, we have to remember that as much as Governor Walz just accused Donald Trump of being an agent of chaos, Donald Trump actually delivered stability in the world, and he did it by establishing effective deterrence. People were afraid of stepping out of line. Iran, which launched this attack, has received over $100 billion in unfrozen assets thanks to the Kamala Harris administration. What do they use that money for? They use it to buy weapons that they're now launching against our allies and, God forbid, potentially launching against the United States as well. Donald Trump recognized that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. They needed to recognize that if they got out of line, the United States global leadership would put stability and peace back in the world. Now, you asked about a preemptive strike, Margaret, and I want to answer the question. Look, it is up to Israel what they think they need to do to keep their country safe, and we should support our allies wherever they are when they're fighting the bad guys. I think that's the right approach to take with the Israel question.
Okay, Robby, so that's J.D. Vance talking about how under Donald Trump, the world was much calmer and more stable, I think is the term that he used. So that, I feel like, as the tensions in the Middle East start to boil over. I mean, no matter what happens in the next month, already a month before the election, you have hundreds of ballistic missiles being fired at Israel from Iran. That feels destabilizing to people. That feels scary. There's two hot conflicts that don't seem to be going in the right direction. That's a powerful argument. And increasingly, I mean, J.D. Vance handled it well. Donald Trump likes to use a similar argument. I don't know, coming out of this debate, it feels like maybe that's the big theme going forward from now until Election Day.
Yeah, what I would like to hear more from Trump and Vance on this is more specificity in how their foreign policies would be different from the current administration and make us safer, because it isn't very vibes-based. It's very Trump kept us safe. They're addressing the idea that Trump's a madman and he's chaotic and destabilizing, saying, well, that's not true. We were safer. Foreign nations respected us, et cetera. And I think there is something to that up until a point, but I want to be forward facing. Like, the world is on fire. Israel, Iran, the Middle East, Ukraine, et cetera. It's not enough to just assure me that Trump's got this because things were so great. What specifically is he going to do? And actually what J.D. Vance did say about the Israel-Iran thing is that he, stands with Israel's right to basically do whatever they think is in their best interest.
He said Israel will decide.
Which I don't know if that even is even different from what the Biden administration feels, because they kind of say they don't like what Israel's doing, but have done absolutely nothing to constrain them, which is maybe fine, but they say they don't like what they're doing. And so then you'd think they would. I mean, this speaks to Biden's invisibility as the leader of our nation right now. And that creates a lot of uncertainty, I think, around the American people.
And J.D. Vance seemed more, this sounds silly, but vice presidential than Tim Walz, who, as a governor, he's probably uncomfortable with foreign policy in a way a senator is not. And in a lot of the back of their mind right now, they're thinking this person could be the president. That's more acute now than it has been for a lot of Americans, given what's going on in the White House.
I honestly don't think of any of these four people as necessarily like foreign policy people, but that isn't necessarily a criticism, because the bipartisan foreign policy expert establishment class, I would argue, led us astray. And that's a commonality that populists on both the right and left and libertarians and various people, a criticism we all have. So that's fine that they don't really, if they don't align with whatever the dominant strain is.
So, Robby, before we wrap, what's your top line from this debate? What was the biggest takeaway?
I mean, I do think it was a pretty bruising performance by Walz. I think
by Vance.
Walz was bruised the bruising
okay.
was done. Yeah, I was like, man, it's late. We're all starting to get a little tripped up. I don't think it matters, and I continue to think Tim Walz's biggest liability is simply that he is not Josh Shapiro, and that he is not the popular governor of the most important swing state, and it baffles me that he was the pick. I don't understand what he adds to the ticket relative to someone with a proven track record of winning over independent and Republican voters in the state that is extremely likely to decide the election, where Kamala Harris is currently up 1.5 or 2 points, maybe, in a state where, if you check the polling, a week before the election last time, in 2020, Joe Biden is up in Pennsylvania by 6 points. In the end, he wins by 1.17 points. There was a 5-point polling error in the favor of the Democrats in terms of the polling. If that happens again, Donald Trump, based on the current polling of where she is, Donald Trump will win the election. You would think every little bit counts. And they just didn't. They didn't go for pick some low-hanging fruit here. Said they have Tim Walz. I don't understand. I don't think he demonstrated what his value add is to the campaign whatsoever. And I don't say that as
Vance
someone who Vance did. I think if Trump was watching that, he's thinking, yeah, I know how to pick him. That was a good job. And I do not say that as someone who's a fan or promoter of J.D. Vance. He does not represent my corner of conservative thought at all. I was not happy when he was picked.
Yes.
But he had a commanding performance.
Yeah, I'll just say I think J.D. Vance solidified himself as really the standard bearer of conservatism in his generation going forward. It was great to have Robby here in studio once again. He was actually back by popular demand after Robby and I did this at the presidential debate itself. It went so well that we decided to have Robby back. His insights are always appreciated. Huge shout out to him for being willing to come here so late and break down and add his insights and perspective on the debate, because this really is the only vice presidential debate of the cycle. Usually you get two, usually you get a couple presidential debates. This time, just about one of each, unless something changes. Can't rule it out. This has been probably the weirdest election ever, and that's a high bar. So thank you for tuning in. We are here every single day, so please make sure to subscribe to the Undercurrents YouTube channel. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We put out a daily audio version of this show for people who like to listen that way. And over at undercurrents.tv for longer versions of interviews just like this one. I asked Robby for one thing he could only say behind the paywall. So if you want to see that, go ahead and subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience. Thank you so much for watching.